Hey, folks, welcome everybody to our slightly delayed show, to which I apologize to my illustrious guest, Justin Fassino, who is the designer of the upcoming Seljuk from GMT Games, which, if I was good at this, which I probably wasn't, I would have put a link to it in the video description. So if there is a link to the video description, you'll know whether I was having a good day or a bad day. It was probably a bad day. Believe it or not, it is there. So I'd like to welcome everybody. We scheduled this for last Sunday, and I screwed it up and double booked us. And the other thing was the thing with Harold and Matt from the awards, and you were outnumbered. So
I get it. It was Harold Buchanan. I understand.
so sorry about Harold is a very important man, as you know,
Yes,
and
absolutely.
does not have any patience for my tomfoolery. So
No.
all right, so Justin, first of all, thanks for agreeing to sit down with me. As you folks might have seen, I just unboxed the latest Levy campaign game, Inferno, and it's a super hot series that has really been heating up for the last really couple of years, especially in the design space. And there's a whole huge pile of things that are already on P500, and another even larger pile that's in development. We're going to get into all of that. So first of all, let me ask, because we've been corresponding here and there for a while now, and so what was your introduction to wargaming? How long have you been doing it?
Yeah, probably, I would say 12 years, I guess. And it started with actually a YouTube video that someone did a review on of all things Indian Abyss, the first coin game. And I remember watching. I was into tabletop games before that, and my girlfriend at the time and I used to always play. But I remember watching that video, and I was subscribed to a bunch of content creators who did reviews, and I remember watching that video being like, who would design and play a game about the Colombian drug war? Like what is that as a theme? But then as I watched the video review, I was like, wow, this looks really mechanically kind of interesting, and so I wanted to give it a shot. And out of that kind of like spark of interest, I ended up picking up A Distant Plane, which was like my first war game, and I loved it. And I broke my brain. So like war game is one of those things where it's like a language that you have to kind of learn to speak in a lot of ways. And I had no experience with the language, and so I tried to like forehand a game of A Distant Plane to like learn how to play it, playing all the factions. And I like it was like a mental meltdown trying to do that. But I enjoyed it enough that I kept going. And so that was kind of the beginning. And then from there, I branched out into other games by Volko. So Wilderness War followed shortly after that, and that was like my first CDG that I played. And then Twilight Struggle, because I liked that mechanic, and Labyrinth followed. So it was like I went down the rabbit hole really hard. And like 12 years later, it's like my attic looks like a game store.
So you're also big into the hex and counter stuff. I know we watched with rapt attention. I'm sure I'm speaking for everybody. Your recent AeroCore series, for example, which is a fantastic series and a fantastic game. So tell us how you kind of transitioned, at least part of the time, into the sort of more old fashioned war games, which I will use the hex and counter shorthand here for.
Yeah, so I mean, like I'll play anything, right? Like I have no predispositions to any specific type of game, other than maybe I don't like enjoy tactical scale games as much. But like mechanically speaking, or hex and counter versus area move versus whatever, like I don't. If the game is good, the game is good. And so as I was like going down the rabbit hole, I was like, well, I've played point to point, I've played like area control, I've played abstract, so I was like, I want to try this hex and counter thing. That seems like really hardcore. And then like I was no stranger to hex and counter, right? Like I played Twilight Imperium a lot. That was like my favorite game ever. It still is my favorite game ever.
It's a
And
good
that's
game.
big hexes. So,
Well,
it
they're
wasn't that
big,
much
but
of
there's
a leap.
miniatures, so it sort of only half counts.
Sure, yeah. We'll call that a hex and a half a hex and counter game.
I'm not sure that the original version of that actually didn't have counters, to be honest about it. And I had
Mm.
it back in the day, but I've owned every edition of Twilight Imperium, so
Like the
except for the new one.
original one from like the
Yeah,
early 90s that like Christian Peterson was like assembling in his garage.
yeah.
Wow.
That may have had counters. I'm not sure. I clearly remember. I know the second edition had plastic, very bad plastic miniatures, and I still have my third edition.
Oh yeah,
But
same. I actually have not upgraded to fourth edition of that game yet. I did play it a couple weeks ago and I won, which I think is the first time I've ever won that game.
there you go.
But yeah, it's the third edition is great with all the content in it.
Okay, so I think you've already answered the next question I was going to ask, which is what kind of games you play recreationally, and we certainly have seen on your channel, which I think I didn't remember to link in the video description, but just a guard, go follow that channel if you're not following it already. It's very good. Um, so what attracted you to this might be a vapid question, actually. Now that we've gotten that context, what specifically, mechanically or thematically, attracted you to Levy and Campaign in the first place? Did you play Nevsky when it came out, for example?
Yeah, I did. I P500'd. I was one of the P500 folks on Nevsky, and I basically just P500'd it for one reason, and that's because Volko's name was on it. I have yet to
Mm-hmm.
play a game that he has designed that I have not enjoyed, and so like when he said that his next project after Coin was going to be this like weird Teutonic Russian like medieval operational thing with like these little square mats and wooden pieces, I was like, I have no idea what this is, but I'm definitely in for that. And then when it came out, me and my main wargaming partner, we played it like 4 times in 2 weeks, like so a lot. And every play of that game, um, first of all, it was a surprise. So like the very first game we played, it's so unique and novel, and like there's a lot of weird concepts. Like going back to like the language thing, you need to learn a whole new language to play Levy and Campaign a little bit. And like we just messed up so bad. Like our armies, like, you know, we'd have armies out in the field, they'd be like starving on turn 2, and like they would disband, and like there'd be nothing left. The game was over in like a season and a half of Nevsky the first time. And so we reset it up and played again a couple days later, and we would keep doing that. And every time that we played it, we got better at the game. We were better equipped to handle the logistical overhead and like the forward planning and like all the stuff that makes operational gaming fun. And it was like really rewarding to have that happen. And so as Jason is saying, Jason's also a fellow Levy and Campaign designer. It's totally in your wheelhouse, man. If you like OCS and you like the supply aspect and like forward planning of that, like this is that, but with swords and shields and, you know, oxen.
I have yet to get to actually play Levy and Campaign, so just to get that out there. But I've got all 3 of them that are out so far, and that is exactly what has attracted me to it. It's operational, and it's operational. I mean, if it was a World War II game with those mechanics, they'd be like, yeah, whatever, I get it. But it's operational medieval.
Yeah.
I'm not sure there is anything else that's operational medieval, like ever. I could there might be something, but it's if so, it is obscure to say the least.
Yeah, absolutely. And the other thing, just to add to that, is like what I think also attracted me once I played Nevsky to the system was that like it models operational medieval campaigning really well. Like all of the things you read about, if you read a history of like what it was like to go on campaign as like a lord in the 13th century, and like all the challenges you had to face, the game system services really well. Like that is how you play the game, is to deal with those challenges. And so like in terms of accomplishing that sort of what Volko calls historical time travel, it does so well. Yeah.
So let's start talking then about Seljuk specifically, because tell us first of all, I guess for those who haven't looked at it yet, it's available on P500, so go check it out. But for those who haven't looked at it yet, tell us about the historical context that you're designing in for Seljuk specifically.
Yeah. Okay. So it's a somewhat obscure like setting in history, and there are very few games on the Byzantine Empire, especially in the medieval era, if at all. And so this period of history it starts in 1068 basically, and so we're sort of right after the Byzantine Empire's golden age of resurgence after the Arab conquests, right? So they're just coming out of in this sort of period where they've been contracting and they've been fighting off a bigger Islamic empire. That Islamic empire fractures, and suddenly the Byzantine Empire is able to go on the offensive, and they bring in all sorts of culture and wealth from all around the region. And so 1068 is sort of the tail end of this golden resurgence era where there's a lot of internal corruption, let's say, with the empire bureaucracy, the imperial bureaucracy. And what happens is this emperor comes to power because the previous emperor's wife and him had kind of a love affair. And at this time, as this was happening, the Seljuk Turks are coming out of Central Asia, right? They have taken over the Muslim world in terms of political and military power. They're the de facto rulers from Baghdad. And they start to make incursions to the west. And there's sort of this Muslim schism where the Shia Muslims in the Fatimid Caliphate in Egypt and the Sunni Muslims in Central Asia are kind of in conflict with each other, and so there's sort of a power struggle there. And as the Seljuks are coming out of the east, they have to run into the Byzantine Empire, because obviously Turkey and Asia Minor are like right at the crossroads of where all that stuff comes together. And so that creates a lot of friction with the empire. And so this new emperor in the Byzantine Empire, he there's a plot to put him on the throne by the previous empress because he's a capable military commander, and they're basically like, we need someone who can run the armies, which have been kind of neglected for the last couple decades, and drive the Turks away because they're ravaging the border towns. And so his reign is actually exactly 4 years, and his reign basically ends essentially with the Battle of Manzikert in 1071. So there's already this like really nice chronological narrative wrapper around like the campaign for like up to the Battle of Manzikert that I thought was like great for a game, right? Like it just bookends so nicely because obviously at the Battle of Manzikert in 1071, he's spent the last 4 years sort of building the Eastern Roman army up. He's done a lot of reforms with the currency and all that stuff, and he assembles this massive army full of like all different ethnicities. He's got Vikings and the Varangian Guard and exiles from the Battle of Hastings that have come down to Constantinople. He's got Pechenegs from the Balkans. He's got Eastern Roman soldiers. He's got mercenaries from France, and he's got mercenaries from the Turkic mercenaries from Central Asia. So he assembles this huge army, and he marches out to Eastern Turkey, and he wants to strike a hammer blow against the Turks and end it. And it all goes wrong. I was actually listening to a podcast yesterday where one of the world's like right now current Byzantine primary Byzantine historian says he calls the Battle of Manzikert the Romans were up 3-0 and like lose the game 4-3 in stoppage time. It's like a soccer joke, right? And that sort of starts the ability of the Turks to essentially start colonizing Turkey, and more importantly, it begins the process that leads to the First Crusade 20 years later. So I just thought that ground was like, there's no games about that, and it's so important to world history in so many ways. And there's a lot of really interesting things that happen historically from a character perspective, from like an events perspective, just like random stuff that like you would never expect. And the Battle of Manzikert was pivotal. That I think a lot of people point to that as sort of the beginning of the decline that leads up to the fall of Constantinople in 1453, if you look at it through like a really long-term lens. And also like how many games have Turks in them, right? Like, I mean, Nevsky has the one unit, right? They've got Mongols and Kipchaks who are a Turkic people. And that was sort of the other seed for this design, which was like, hey, could you do a whole game around like this weird like light cavalry ranged unit as like a major like factor in the force pool? And I just, there's a lot of interesting stuff there. And I wish that the Byzantine Empire got more exposure. And in terms of historical stuff, I just like playing games to learn history. So, it was like kind of a natural extension of my interests.
Mm-hmm. I mean, there doesn't seem to be a whole lot. There's, off the top of my head, there's Commands and Colors Medieval, which it starts with, and not sure there's any expansions for that yet either. There's Cataphract, which I think is more early material than late material, and I'd characterize this as late Byzantine. Yeah,
so both Cataphract and Commands and Colors Medieval core box are like 6th century Byzantine. So it's like right after Fall of the West, and it's against the Persians. It's even before Islam, right? So yeah, pretty early.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, like, there's certainly some interesting stuff going on in that period as
well.
But I'm real curious to see the bibliography for this game, by the way. But
I've actually posted a picture on my Twitter account of at some point in the past of all of the books that I had to buy to research to do justice, and it's like this massive pile that like sits next to my desk that's like 3 feet high.
Are any of them by Anthony Caladelis?
Oh yeah. Rivers of Gold, Streams of Blood was one of the books that I used in researching the game. He's an awesome historian.
He was my Byzantine history professor.
Was he really?
Yeah.
That's incredible. I've listened to so many interviews with him, and like
he's really good teacher too, by the way.
Amazing. I need to talk to you about this more. That's amazing.
So I know his translation of The Secret History is now the preeminent translation of Procopius' Secret History as well.
Yep. And he also did a translation of The History by Michael Italiates, who was the military judge on campaign to Manzikert, who chronicled the whole 4-year period of more than the 4-year period, but that 4-year period. Anthony Caldelis has done the newest translation of that sort of firsthand account of Manzikert, which is another book I used for the game as well. So,
so was this a topic? It sounds like it was. Was this a topic you knew a bunch about before embarking on designing a game in this space?
Not whatsoever, actually. So what happened is in that period I was talking about where I was playing Nevsky like 4 times like in a span of 2 weeks, that also just happened to coincide with me listening to the History of Byzantium podcast. And specifically the episode about the Battle of Manzikert, which is like this 2-hour special that's sort of a narrative history of all the stuff that happened leading up to the battle and sort of the outcome of the battle. And that podcast is amazing. If you want to learn anything about Byzantine history, the History of Byzantium is sort of billed as like the sequel to History of Rome, basically like what happens after 476. And the episode, he does special episodes every once in a while about pivotal moments, and this is one of them. And so as I was listening to that narrative history and playing Nevsky and seeing how the modeling of the game mechanics reflected like medieval campaigning, I was just like, in my head, it was just like a light bulb, like those two things merged together so well. And so that was kind of the genesis of it.
I can feel that a little bit because I'm listening to Mike Duncan right now on the Revolutions podcast, and it's a lot of material, right? So I mean, I probably get about 4 hours a week in, and it's loaded with ideas for cool games. Not many of which are war games because it's really not a military history.
Sure.
But I have the History of Byzantium is one I have queued up for later whenever it is that I have free podcast time.
It's excellent.
So,
it's excellent.
So I could get kind of the source of inspiration on being inspired by that. How challenging did you find it to find sources? I mean, hey, you listen to this podcast about Manzikert, and you know this sounds super interesting. How challenging did you find it to find sources for that topic?
Yeah, I mean, so that was one of the huge challenges here. What I was very thankful that the host of the History of Byzantium lists all his sources for every episode. So that was a good launching point to find some of that stuff. And he has had people like Caldelis and Peter Frankopan and other historians on his podcast. So I was able to kind of go down that route. So the challenge with this era, and really anything in sort of like early medieval period, is that like contemporary sources to that period, there's not a lot, right? There's not a ton. If you're, we don't have orders of battle for every unit that was in the Battle of Manzikert, right? And so, and combined with that fact is like the Byzantine Empire is no longer around, right? It's one thing when you're talking about researching England, which is still a country, and there's still records from even early in their history. There's no more Byzantine Empire, and after the Ottomans took over, they kind of expunged a lot of that stuff, or it fell into apathy, or people forgot it. It wasn't kept very like in the same way Western European history was. So I had to rely a lot on modern historical theses and views about what was going on, modern readings of works that came after the period the game is set in that were looking back. And then there are a few, obviously there are a few contemporary sources. There's actually a guy who is a guy from Scotland who is a professor at one of the, University of Edinburgh, who's actually, his whole thing is the history of the Seljuks specifically. And so he's written a lot of great books. His name's Andrew C.S. Peacock, and I use him a lot for Turkic histories because it turns out that the advent of the Seljuk sort of Turkish era, they didn't have any sort of written records. So all of the written records about the Seljuks from this, like the 11th century and early 12th century, are from Arab historians. And so they're all in Arabic. And a lot of those sources are not available in English. And it's also through the lens of another culture. So you're not getting the actual culture. So that was a huge challenge to make sure I was doing justice to the Seljuk side of things.
So yeah, that would be tough. I mean, certainly having looked into the Crusades sources and not speaking Arabic, right? Sources on those kinds of topics that are in English are not very plentiful. Let me put it that way. Like even translations of contemporary Arab sources. Not very much. I had my military history professor, Joe Gilmartin, actually, his PhD was actually in Ottoman history as well. And he was the late Joe Gilmartin, and he was quite a character. So a lot of people will remember his name as well. Also an avid wargamer, by the way.
It's awesome when people who you're like close with, who you have no idea if they war games, suddenly it turns out they're into war games, and you're like, hey, awesome.
Yeah, exactly. So let's talk. Let me pull the map up here, and we'll have a look. And as usual, the map is very attractive, as has been the case with all of the Levian campaign maps. Do you guys have a box cover yet, or is there a box artist? Let me ask, because the boxes have been somewhat divisive. At least Nevsky was. I don't know about Almoravid or.
I actually think Almoravid's is incredibly gorgeous. Like that scene that of the sort of the Muslim soldier in front of the wall. It's like the color palette. That whole thing is so evocative. So I have in my back pocket the artist I want to do the cover. I have spoken to him about doing the cover. He is willing to do the cover, and he's actually a part-time GMT Games fan as well. But he has also done covers for musical artists and albums and stuff like that. So it's all kind of lined up, and it's really
Beyonce takes priority, but you're in line.
That's right. Beyonce is doing the cover to Seljuk. You heard it here first.
Yeah. So this is let me mention this because people will ask. This is near final art, not final art, but it should be really close, and it's definitely in keeping with kind of the distinctive style that has been established for Levy and campaign games so far.
Yeah, and it's done.
Art?
This art is done by Robert Altbauer, who's the same artist who did the map art for and some of the other art for Inferno, which you obviously just unboxed on your channel.
Yeah, which has a fantastic cover. I thought I think I mentioned it in the video. Very very evocative cover. But the one for Nevsky I think was a little divisive. I appreciated, if nothing else, that it did not look like a standard GMT cover, that they were trying for a different look, which I sort of appreciate. So let's talk about. Presupposing that all of us watching here tonight have some at least vague familiarity with Levy and campaign. I'll pull the map back up later, but give us like the capsule description of, for wargamers who haven't played Levy and campaign.
So what I always tell people is it is a 2-player medieval operational war game, strategy war game, where the enemy is not your opponent at the table. The enemy is hunger. Right? Because you have an army, you need to feed them, and that's what's really probably going to take them off the board more so than like getting defeated in battle. It's kind of a joke, kind of tongue in cheek, but I mean that's what it is, right? It's a game about medieval maneuver and logistics, and it's combat is one element to it, but it's much more about like being efficient with your actions and making sure that you have enough supplies to accomplish the goals you're going to do, and it features programmed turn like structure, programming your turns, which is a mechanic I absolutely hate. Like I will never play Robo Rally again in my entire life, but in this it works because it creates a fog of war. So every turn, you have all these different armies on the map, and each army has a card, and you make a deck in the order that you want those armies to activate. And then you alternate with your opponent. And because you and your opponent are making those decks secretly and you don't know which order they put things in, it creates this amazingly great narrative engine for really hilarious things to happen, where you're like, I'm going to go crush this guy, and then it turns out that he actually moves away before you can get there, and then you go to chase him, and then suddenly you're out of supply, and your army starts starving, and then you try and siege a castle like really quickly, because if you don't get into the castle and take all their food, your army's going to go away. And there's just like really hilarious things. I swear to God, there's a rule in Levy and campaign in every game. It always happens. I've seen it in every one. There's always a garrison that holds out against incredible odds at like the most critical time. And sometimes it's great because it's your garrison, and sometimes you're like, how did that one crossbowman hold off the horde that was storming the walls? So it's just great. I mean, it's just a really fun narrative engine that has a lot of really interesting mechanics.
The crossbowman is obviously French.
That's right. Yeah.
I shall now taunt you a second time. So what unique? So I've heard some buzz now about sort of new features that Nevsky that Seljuk brings to Levy and campaign. So let's talk about that.
Yeah, so the key thing, obviously, and similar with Coin as well, like you want every conflict to feel like it's evoking the history and add something new that is like historically appropriate. The big things in this one, so if you're familiar, if you've played other games in the series, it's mostly, I would say you're probably 85% of the way, 80 to 85% of the way to learning this, knowing this. But some of the key new stuff in this one, first of all, this was a period where there were a lot of mercenaries being employed and a lot of untrustworthy Normans, and Turks for that matter. So some of your lords can switch sides. It's different than in Inferno, where you've got sort of that back and forth treachery thing going on. But there are lords that can switch sides at a moment's notice, and you can try and bribe them to get them to switch sides. So that's something that's a little bit new. The major, more new things here are all sort of around the asymmetry. So this is probably the most asymmetric Levy and campaign game that is out or on P500, and that has a lot to do with the different capabilities of both sides and how both sides were like organized as a nation state. So like the Byzantine Empire, you can see all these provinces on the map. These are what are called the thema, the themes, and each theme had sort of like regional troops that were assigned to defend it, and they were they didn't operate beyond those borders. And so that is reflected here in the game. So in previous Levy and campaign games, your garrisons at your cities would just kind of spawn, right? When they would come under siege, you would just have units spawn. On this one, the Roman player, for their garrisons, they can assign some of their themata, the thematic troops in those provinces, to defend as a garrison, or they can choose not to defend as a garrison, and they can recruit those troops on the campaign trail, which is something that's different than other games, or they can use those troops to defend against ravaging, right? So there's this, the ravaging mechanic is built out a little more here, and that ties into the Seljuk player. Their victory objectives are way different, so they don't score points for conquering territory. They score more for ravaging. They have a yearly goal in terms of the amount of destruction they need to cause to the Byzantine Empire every year. That ratchets up every year. And if they fail to make that, then they lose victory points. And so there's kind of this big asymmetry between how each side is scoring points and how they go about achieving those objectives. And so that's kind of like the bigger new thing here is that the Romans have these units that you don't see in other games that are a finite resource that they can use in different ways. And the Turks are much more against the clock, right? You need to keep them moving, keep them pushing.
So this just visibly of the 4 games in the series that I've like looked at, right, which means the three that I have in this one, this does seem the most asymmetric to me because you're talking about 2 very different ways to fight, right? Yeah. Between the Byzantines, old established empire, kind of doddering, and the sort of vital Turks that have just rolled in and have brought real innovations to the way war gets fought in this part of the world for the next few hundred years.
Yeah.
So to me that makes sense, and I don't know that either. Certainly, our Inferno, it's these Italians fighting these other Italians, so in pretty much the same area. So it's not like there's a huge cultural gap there, right?
Yeah, and that comes back to what I was saying earlier about like in Nevsky, there's this one single unit that's a light horse from the Asian steppe, right? Mm-hmm. It's got like no armor, but it's like really good at range combat, and like that was, playing Nevsky and seeing that unit come out, you're like, well, what a weird thing to like be in the middle of this like Teutonic Russian, like big stumbling armored guys rolling around. And so like this is really more of a game about like, okay, well, if you have like a heavily armored, force empire and a bunch of invading nomads or Muslim armies that are primarily built around archery and horseback combat. Like, what does that look like? And in this system, what does that look like? And there are benefits actually for having an army that is nothing but Turkic horse units. You get extra movement speed. They're really fast, and the Byzantines aren't as fast. And so, when it forces the Roman player to kind of adopt the doctrine that they used during the Arab conquest and during this period, which is like you let them in the front door, you let them steal some stuff, and then when they're weighted down with all that treasure, you go and attack them, right, to like get it back.
So take us into the kind of decision space for each side here. You've got I guess we'll start with the Byzantines.
Yeah.
What are the kinds of decisions that the Byzantine player is going to be challenged to make?
Yeah, so starting off, first of all, you'll see in the upper left Constantinople, right? That's like the city of power, but it's actually not, it's a holding box. It's actually not on this map. We're looking at Eastern Turkey. Mm-hmm. And it's about, it's a couple hundred miles to walk from Constantinople to the conflict zone, the frontier here. And so most of your lords, as you can see next to the Constantinople box, have their seats in Constantinople. So every year, at the start of every year, in this game, you'll notice on the calendar, there's a winter, like the winter is not actually a campaign turn. It's kind of like an interphase where everyone resets and goes home. And that's just because historically there wasn't a lot of activity in winter during this 4-year period militarily. And also Eastern Anatolia is super rugged. The mountains are really high elevation. You get a lot of snow, and it's just impossible to do stuff in the winter. So there's a kind of an ebb and flow, right? So as the Roman player, every spring, every new year as it starts, you're going to have to march from Constantinople. And that is a slow march. It takes a lot more resources to march from Constantinople than it does just to one space on the map. And so because most of your military power is back there, you're going to be getting a slow start to contest the Turks. And so one of your decision points is, okay, what kind of defense am I trying to build this year? And you can't just win with defense. You do need to score points by going on offense. You do need to conquer some Seljuk strongholds, because historically the Emperor Romanos was, I want to build a buffer state between the Seljuks and the Byzantines in sort of this Armenia, Eastern Turkey region. And so you're going to have to do that in order to win the game. And so it's how much do you push offensively? How much do you try and protect against Seljuk ravaging? Because if you can protect well enough in a given year, you'll actually lose the Seljuk player points, right? And so it's this kind of give and take where you're like, okay, how much can I push? How much should I pull back? At the beginning, in the call to arms, hey, Volko.
Volko's here. We got to be on our best behavior now.
In the call to arms phase, the Roman player can actually place what's a strategic objective on the map, and if they're able to successfully accomplish either conquering that location or disbanding that lord, they'll get a bonus victory point for that. So it's sort of like the emperor. Look, you imagine the emperor standing over his table of the empire with his generals, being like, "There, we're going there this year," kind of thing. And so those are the types of decisions that you have to make. It's a much more adaptive viewpoint of the game. You don't just have a singular mission. And so that's kind of the Roman side. On the Seljuk side, they are under the gun, right? They've got to make progress every year so that they don't lose VPs, and they also can score bonus victory points if they can get loot home. But in the system, while your armies are carrying around loot, you're really slow and really vulnerable, because if you get ambushed or you have to go into combat and you lose, you have to drop it all and give it back to the player who attacked you. And so, there's how deep do they go, right? Like, how deep do you want to push into the empire? There might be easier places to ravage and potentially siege behind enemy lines, but can you get that stuff home at the end of the year? And obviously, coming back to the Roman themata, it's like if you can wear down those regional troops along the front, then you can make more progress every year. So you might sort of that first year not do as much as you could do, but weaken them up so that in later years you can make more progress. And so that's kind of the dynamic at play. That's the decision space that both players are looking at from a macro perspective, like over the course of the campaign. And then it gets a little more tactical. The goal is to have 5 scenarios. So you can play each year of the 4-year period as its own like shorter scenario that would take probably like 2 or 3 hours, or you can play the whole thing. And those are much different decision spaces that you'd want to be looking at, because at the end of 1 year, you don't have to think about, okay, what happens if I don't ravage enough, or if I ravage too deeply, kind of thing.
Okay. So I mean, this sounds pretty cool so far, right? And I guess let me ask, how I know you've been working on this for a couple of years now, right?
Yeah.
Okay. So so you're probably looking at, I don't know, a 3 to 5 year, development cycle from, hey, what a great idea this would be, to it the big day arriving and it shows up on P500 and it looks like it's doing pretty good on P500, which is great. So tell us about kind of the what you started with. This is your first game design, right?
It is, yeah.
Okay. So kind of tell us how you started that, approaching it from the very beginning. It's like day one comes and what a fabulous idea, and there's a light bulb and everything. How do you even get started with?
Yeah. So right before I start that, I see that Meandering Mike in the chat asked that Antioch and Aleppo, the names are in red, and he's just asking what that means on the map. Those are the red text is all the major level 3 cities. So Antioch, Aleppo, and then Ani in the northeast corner in Armenia. Those are all the biggest cities on the map, and that's just to show some visual difference so you can see where the prime real estate is. So originally, if you want like the moment it started as like an idea, I was in the car driving to work listening to the history of Byzantium, and it just like all clicked. And I was like, as I was pulling into the parking garage, I was like, okay, if I do this and we use these mechanics to model this. And in that period, I sort of, what I decided was, okay, I need some sort of guide for this, right? Because it's not just, I want to make a game that is in this period. It's, I need to make a game that roughly follows historical contours, but also allows players to feel like they're impacting the game in a way that is open to their strategy, or maybe takes historical, detours around what actually happened. You don't want like a perfectly scripted game, because that's not really a game, and you don't want a game that doesn't reflect history at all. And so I knew I needed some sort of guideline to like keep me in that channel. So the first thing I did was I put together a design document that was 3 things. It was 1, all the things that I wanted to accomplish if I imagined sitting down and playing the game. So it was like, what does it feel like to play? What are the things that it needs to have in order to feel like it's set in this era? And so I jotted down a bunch of mechanical ideas, a lot of which didn't make it into the final design just because for various reasons, but a lot of them did. And then I started playing around with that to make sure it felt right. And then once it felt right, I said, okay, what is the tempo that you want the game to have, right? Because you want the different, like if you look at the calendar, there's actually notes about what happened historically. I want players not only to have those things happen roughly around the same time, if possible, but also to feel like that the game's not off the rails, that the decisions that they are making will lead them into the mentality where they need to do those things that historically were challenging. And so I wrote down a chronology of all the events that we knew about that happened in this 4-year period from a military perspective, like a campaigning perspective. And I said, okay, these are the things that we need to express somehow in the game, whether that's through an event card, a capability, a geographical feature, right, or all 3. And so like a good example of that would be, in 1071, Alp Arslan's racing from Syria to confront the emperor at Manzikert. And he takes a shortcut basically that crosses a river in sort of the mountainous regions in the east, and a flash flood wipes away his baggage train as he's like on his way to like the Battle of Manzikert. So it's like, you want that to happen in the game. That's a cool moment, and so that was sort of the impetus for developing mountain passes. And so those are the dark brown connections on the map, and there are cards, weather cards that can affect of whether those are open or closed in different seasons, and how you can move around the map. They're more expensive to move through. They're more expensive to supply through. And so, a lot of that stuff you wanted to make sure happens in the game narratively so that players get that experience. And then the third thing was I didn't know the history, so I had to write down all of the people, the important people that were in this period, and who makes the cut for the game. Are they important enough to be a lord, or are they just important enough to be a card? And then so I wrote all that out. It's like an 8 or 9 page document, and I still take it to every convention where I do demos to show people what the genesis of the game was. And that was kind of my Bible. So as I was designing and thinking about cards and thinking about how long the game was going to be and what the structure of the turns was, whether it was 40 days or 90 days as is in this case, and how you evoke those things and how you make sure that armies move the historical amount properly. That was all kind of taken into consideration in that initial design sketch. And I think if I were to design another game, which I plan to, I would do that again, because that process was so helpful, because it immediately told me if something was off. Where if I was doing a playtest and it didn't follow sort of the rough historical contours, then I needed to change something or needed to add something or take something away. And so, yeah, if I would give one recommendation to anyone looking to design a game, sketch out everything from the history, people, place, you're writing a play, what the story is, what the people are, where it's set, and all that stuff. And I think it was super helpful that way. Okay,
that's actually super interesting. I wouldn't necessarily have thought of that. So being a non-designer, right? So then the next question is: there's a very robust and hopping Levy and campaign design space right now. How helpful was that around when you started, and how helpful was it throughout the rest of the process?
So first of all, incredibly helpful. And in fact, there's some of the folks from that Discord are in the chat right now. I see. So that was not around when during the initial phases of the design, and it got kind of spun up. I don't actually know the origins about how it got spun up. I just one day got an invite from the guy. Why am I forgetting his name? Jesus, the designer of Plantagenet. He's gonna kill me. I'm having one of those old brain fart moments. Yeah. Anyways, he sent me an invite, and he was just join the Levy and campaign Discord. I'm like, oh, this must be a place where people who like to play the game gather, and it is that. But it's also this amazing incubation space that has really embraced just collaborative design. Volko is in there every day chatting with everyone who has ideas about games. What hypothetical things, could you take the system to the 30 Years' War or the Ancients period, or and there's lots of discussions. Yeah, thank you, Volko. Paco, oh my goodness, yes, thank you. Designer of Plantagenet and Cuyus Regio, that's on P500 as well.
Super excited about Cuyus Regio.
So am I. Yeah, that map is incredible.
Yes, it is. I saw the map in Stuka Joe's pictures from Bioticon from I think last year, and I'm like, ooh, what's this?
Yeah.
And I was delighted when it just suddenly showed up on GMT's P500 one day. I'm like, oh well, that's great.
Insta-click, insta-buy. Yeah.
There we go. We'll be happy to have that.
So it got spun up, I think, by him and Volko, as far as I know. But now there's hundreds of people in there, and it's not just designers. I mean, there are a lot of designers as well. And I think
even I'm in there. I've never said a word.
It's really cool. Paco started the Discord to help find playtesters from Plantagenet, and what it's blossomed into is this really cool collaborative space. And I think it's actually a neat model for how you can systemize a game, right? Because you find the most passionate people, you find the best ideas, you have these amazing discussions about history or about whatever, under game topics, medieval logistics. I mean, some of the threads that we have in that Discord are really fun. It's just random funny medieval art that you find, or hilarious comics from the Far Side that are about that reflect a specific moment you always get in Levy and campaign, about sieges and stuff. So yeah, it's been super helpful, and it's international as well. So one of the guys, there's a couple of folks in there who have helped me specifically on this design. First of all, place names on a map that's geographically accurate to the 11th century. Probably the most labor-intensive thing that I have had to do in the design was getting the map to be correct, because you've got Arab, Turkic, and Greek names for places, and a lot of the times the same place is named different things, and there's no description about which place they're referring to. They just, because at the time you're expected to know, this place is this. And so triangulating all that information, it was super difficult. And so there was a couple of Greek speakers in the Levy Campaign Discord server that helped me with Greek place names and what they were known as historically. There's a guy named Raed, who I think I'm saying that properly. If I'm not, I apologize. Who's from, I think, Saudi Arabia or somewhere in the Middle East, and he helped me a lot with the Arabic sources. So he tracked down some Arab language sources for me, specifically for place names, but also for other things as well. And just, stuff that you would never have the availability to go find or access to. Everyone's kind of pooling together in the Discord server and helping each other with that kind of stuff. And it's like amazing, right? So when someone who's Greek Orthodox comes and, looks at the map at a convention and says, I really love this about the map XYZ, you're like, oh yeah, someone helped me with that in the Discord server that I would have never known that. And so to get that accuracy and get that sort of like nod to the cultural legacy is super important. And it's super awesome that the Discord has enabled that.
It actually reminds me of, I don't know if anybody watching will actually recognize what the hell I'm talking about here. It actually reminds me in a good way of an RPG community called The Forge that was around for a little while, except less stifling, because there was sort of a mastermind in charge there. And at one point, he literally decided that all discussion of theory will now cease because we are done. We have completed the work, and it is now perfect.
Right.
But out of that community, before that idiocy happened, there was like a lot of really fresh and new things that came out. A lot of which developed off of the same systems, and some fairly popular indie RPGs that are still around right now have evolved out of that. So we got a couple questions here. The Duck Overlord asks, would you consider Seljuk a good first Levian campaign game? Well, and if not, what would be the ideal Levian campaign game? First time.
That's a great question, and I think the answer is probably different depending on who you ask. I can't really say. I mean, I've been buried in this game, so like my perspective on Seljuk is like so different than anyone else's because like I've played it the most. I have like created it. Yes, thank you. Ryan is from Dubai. Thank you. I appreciate that. But playtest feedback on Seljuk has told me that it is sort of on the lower complexity end. So there's only one type of transport asset with carts. So unlike Nevsky, where you've got 4 different kinds you got to keep track of, like it's more like Inferno, where there's only one. So the logistical burden is lighter. It doesn't have the more complex political situation that you'd find in Almoravid. So I would say of the games that have been released so far, Seljuk is, I would guess, probably one of the better ones to start with, although I still think the best one, if you want to just get your feet wet and get a small experience, will be Henry, which is one that Joe Schmidt is designing about the Agincourt campaign, because it's sort of a smaller box game. But yeah, of sort of like the bigger Levian campaign games, the feedback has been that it is a good one that you could start with. But it really just depends on what you like. Like some people really like maneuver and that kind of stuff, or they really like logistics. And each game kind of offers you different options in those regards.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I'm gonna say that from what I can see here, and not having looked at the book to Seljuk at all, but I have looked at the other 3. There's not like a vast difference in complexity level between the 3 games that are out, right? So if you are specifically interested in one topic over the others, I think that's reason enough to start with that one. It's not like there's a huge, amount of overhead in any of these. So,
yeah. Although I will say that the system, kind of like Coin, in the way that like Coin just kind of integrated things that made the system kind of sing as more titles came out. Like if you go back and play Andean Abyss, it's a very pure experience, right? And then as you got into Cuba Libre and Distant Plain and Fire in the Lake, there were a lot of things that became series standards to Coin that were carried forward. I'm starting to see that now, just as someone who plays Levian Campaign and is designing for it. You're starting to see some stuff be implemented on the series level that it makes the games, as you go on further in the titles, just like little tighter things around the edges, right? Like in Nevsky, for example, you couldn't bypass a stronghold, right? So if you moved into an enemy stronghold, your turn was over, and if you had extra commands to spend on that lord, he couldn't do anything. Well, starting with Almoravid and moving into Inferno and Seljuk and all the other ones coming up, now there's an option where you have a little more options there, where if you enter an enemy stronghold, you don't have to besiege it. You can use the rest of your actions by bypassing the stronghold. It's like little stuff like that is like starting to like kind of come together nicely as more games come out, and you'll start to, I think, see backported to some of the earlier volumes.
Excuse me. And there's how many Levy campaign games are on P500 right now? I mean, I think it's a bunch, right?
Yeah, it's 3. So Plantagenet, Henry, and then I think Seljuk is the third one that was added. It's the number 6 in the series. Now that Inferno is shipped. So yeah. Mm-hmm.
So I assume everyone already has their copy of Inferno since I got mine. So I will continue to whine about that with no factual basis whatsoever for at least the next 8 years. Not limited to Inferno, obviously. There's a poster on the wall at GMT that says "Ship his games last."
Yeah.
I'm pretty sure.
Well, it's funny because it's like, oh, maybe it's just like proximity to GMT's warehouse, but then it's like, no, people in Europe got theirs, and then I'm in just a couple states away. So it's like it's like quantum, like
You
Schrodinger's.
can drive down there and pick yours up.
Right, exactly. Yeah, exactly.
I mean, it's a drive, but it's doable. You'd have to make a trip out of it. You're not doing that there and back in one day. I've driven that actually. It sucks.
Part of it sucks. Once you get to Oregon, it's pretty nice.
Well, no, but it's a long drive.
Oh,
It's
yeah.
a lot of mountain driving, right? We
Yeah.
drove up the coast from San Jose to Seattle, and it was like, I don't know, an 18-hour drive or something like that. And I drove the whole way, and I was absolutely almost in a coma at the end of that drive. So, and I want to say, we didn't drive through Central Valley, and there in Central Valley, but so were there any wargame influences on the design of Seljuk from outside the Levy and campaign series?
Yeah, definitely. So I think the biggest one, just from a mechanical standpoint, was so if you've played Empire of the Sun, you know about the progress of war that the Americans have to make. That was a big inspiration behind the Seljuk rating goal every year, right? Like you have to make progress, otherwise bad things happen. I think that's probably the most overt one that I can think of, but certainly any asymmetric game where you're talking about really interesting situations where it's like you've got one force that is one like specialty, one force that's another, and you're trying to like figure out how those fit together in a way. I often say with Seljuk, it's like you need to dictate the tempo of the campaign to play a way that advantages your faction. And both players are trying to do that. And so there's numerous games that kind of have that approach to things. But that's one of my favorite types of games, are heavily asymmetric games. And so not that I would recommend anyone do an asymmetric game for their first design. I probably should not have, but because it requires a lot of balancing, very fine-tuning to make sure it feels right. But certainly that love of asymmetry is definitely part of the game, just overall in general.
But they're war games. They're always asymmetric, right? I mean, to some
Hold
extent.
on. Roman Civil War, everyone would have me believe that it was just the Romans bashing into each other.
Well, I mean, there's some are more asymmetric than others, right? There are, like, Inferno seems like a not super asymmetric game. It is, but I mean, there's some differences in the way things, the outlook between those two factions and the sort of the tools they have to work with. But I mean, it's a historical situation. The historical situation was not perfectly symmetrical. It's not perfectly symmetrical.
I mean, yeah, but like even in like modern day, you start to find that there's more symmetry in the technology that people are using, right? And it's like the asymmetry comes in like their doctrine and how they use it. Versus like in the medieval era, it was just like, hey, we know how to make bows out of horn and sinew, and you have chosen to like use maces and whatever. And so it's like there's like a wide disparity sometimes in that type of asymmetry, which is I think also part of the reason that like ancients and medieval games are popular amongst that crowd, right? Because it's not like everyone's got artillery. It's like some people have artillery and some people have Bowie knives,
I can vouch, John, that this is not the case. It seems to be semi-random, actually. Multi-man ships based on how soon you ordered, but I don't believe that GMT does. Happy to be corrected on that by somebody that knows. But I guess let me ask this then, on sort of pursuing that avenue is how did you go about sort of pitching this to GMT, right? It's like, hey, here's one of 2 million Levy and campaign games in development right now. I think you should pick mine next.
Yeah, part of that was, I think, part of Volko's original pitch, and he talks about this sometimes as well, is that he actually had an idea for Four Corners of Europe would be the system, right? So a medieval conflict in each of the four corners of Europe. So he had already envisioned it as a series, as evidenced by the fact that Nevsky came out as Volume 1.
And
obviously Volk, what's that?
It says Volume 1 on the box. So.
Right. Yeah, exactly. And that was the other reason, by the way, I ordered it. I was like, oh, there's going to be a series of games. That's amazing. I'm in. I'll get on the ground floor. And so that was kind of, I think, the original concept. And Volko, correct me if I'm wrong if you're still watching. But I think, so yeah, the way it got started at GMT, so like I had started designing this. I had the original, before I had started designing, I had sent Volko an email, and I was just like, hey, this is this period in history that your model would work amazingly well for in case there's other people working on games. And the response that he sent me was just like, yeah, you should go do that. try it. And I was just like, oh, okay. I mean, I guess I could try that. I mean, I don't know, maybe. And so yes, I started working on it, and it was just kind of like a project that I was doing. Like the outcome wasn't like, oh, I'm gonna get this published. It was just kind of like, I'll make a game that I will enjoy playing, and if people like it, maybe it'll get published. But then I was going to the GMT weekend at the warehouse, and I had a physical prototype built, and I told Voco, and he was like, oh, I'll give him a heads up that you're bringing it. So I just didn't like some rando just showing up with a game that they made at GMT's thing.
I'm totally doing that one of these days. I'm totally doing that one of these days with some 8-map monstrosity.
I mean, what's awesome about the warehouse is that they're cool with that. Like, if people want to bring a prototype, I don't know of any situation where they're like, yeah, get that out of here, which is like really cool of them. So it was me and Joe Schmidt who was bringing. He was bringing his prototype for Henry at the same weekend at the warehouse, and so Voco, I think, thought it was a great idea to have two sort of Levy and campaign prototypes there, just as a way to promote the series, and so gave them a heads up, and then from there it just kind of the Discord was taking off at that point, and GMT had sort of like this sense that there was interest in the series. Volko was doing another 2 games at that point. And so I think that snowball of momentum was just kind of like a perfect storm of like stuff happening around the series that made them embrace the idea that there's this series of weird medieval operational games. And I think even internally, to some degree, it's sort of its own siloed thing. That is like different than the way that they normally develop products for a number of reasons, which is cool that's able to exist. And that's how it happened. So a couple of visits to the warehouse. I ended up meeting the folks at GMT, Jason Carr and Gene, and having chats with them. I ran into them at SD HisCon. I don't know. The board game is a small space, right? Like you meet someone at a convention and suddenly you're chatting with them every time you're at an event or just online. And so it just ended up being a thing. And as designers started coming on board and more ideas coming out there, there was a real serious assessment of like, okay, where are these games? Are they viable products? Can we queue these in a way that would lead to a commercial release? And it just so happened that I had probably been working on mine longer than a lot of people, and it slotted into a nice soft spot.
Cool. All right, folks. So if anybody has any final questions for Justin, I'm going to start moving this on a trajectory towards completion. But let me, I'll have a couple more questions here while we wait for the viewers to respond. To what extent this is kind of another inside the actor studio type question, right? To what extent are designers for, say, GMT, encouraged to help do some of the promotional work to get that game off the ground, right? When hey, we're ready to hit P500, we want to make a big splash. Is there like a conversation with GMT about that, or is it just it's up to the individual designer and they can do it to whatever extent they would like? I mean, if you're Mo Kerman or Volko, you don't need to. But.
Right, exactly. Your name's on a box and it gets 500 orders overnight, right? I can only speak to my experience, and I sort of came into the process with zero expectations, right? Like even after they were like, hey, this is something we might be interested in putting on P500, I wasn't going to be like, oh, that's happening until like literally the week before and I got a notification. I tell this story. It's actually funny. When Gene previewed that, how he does the hints in the newsletter about like what is going to be added to P500, I remember opening the newsletter and reading, and I was like, is that my game? And like I frantically emailed Volko. I'm like, do I have to do anything?
What is happening?
Yeah, exactly. But in my experience, so I have a background professionally in marketing and communications, and so I knew that if I ever got to a point where it was going to become a real thing, that I would have a plan already together of stuff that I wanted to do. And so when we were going through Seljuk's going to be in the newsletter this month, and here's what we need from you. And I basically asked them, I was like, hey, here's some of the things I'm thinking of doing. I've got an article for Inside GMT that I would love to send you. They said, sure, great. I said, I've got a video that I want to do on YouTube that just kind of gives an overview of the game. They're like, sure, great, we'll put it on the page. It just kind of organically happened. And I guess not really an answer to your question, but I would say that like if anyone's designing a game and they do find a publisher for it, they should be trying to market and promote it on their own anyways, regardless of whether or not a publisher is going to help them. I think it only can benefit you, right? And I think personally, so going into it, I was like, okay, in my wildest dreams, if we got to 500 orders in like a couple of months, I would be like, that's a huge success, right? Like it's a weird, obscure topic. I'm a first-time designer. It's a series that it's very popular and hot and there's a lot of entries, but it's like, what if it falls off suddenly? Who knows, right? So, and the fact that we're almost at 500 now. I think we're at like 488 when I checked earlier today, and it's only been a couple of weeks. Is like mind blowing. And so, anything that any effort I'm putting towards what I'm doing has been like rewarded like 100-fold, I feel like. And so it's just good to do that as a designer, right? If you want to be successful, don't rely on anyone else to like tell people about your stuff. Like work with whoever will help you and do stuff. Like
Makes
do it
sense to
yourself.
me. If you've got the marketing chops to do it anyway, which I certainly don't, then and some other designers don't, right? I mean, I think if you're sort of on like an extremely well-established brand, maybe you don't need to, whether that's a designer's name on the box or a series title on the box or whatever it is. I don't think MMP needs tons of help selling OCS titles, for example.
Of
Right.
course, of course. Yeah, and it's going to be different too by publisher, right? I just, there's like there, I think right now, especially, and you can obviously you're a perfect example of this. There is sort of like a personality like space growing in war games, right? Whereas before it was all about the games or the publishers. Now there's content creators, there's people doing playthroughs, there's people live streaming.
There's that annoying guy on YouTube who complains about me every week.
Yeah, exactly, right? And so, like, I think there's like really fertile ground there for people who want to be designers and content creators, or content creators who want to try their hand at design. There's like a whole bunch of new avenues now where it's not just a business thing. It's like, you are associated with, like, you are associated with whatever project you're working on, and there's also other stuff you're known for.
Actually, let me. This is a great question from Nerd Workshop, and I'll kind of fold that into a slightly larger question about playtesting. What was your approach to playtesting? Was it you kind of built out the whole game and then started fiddling with it yourself, and then brought other people in? How did that work exactly?
Yeah, so the way I did it is I would recommend no one does it this way. But what I did was, so I came up with the idea for the game. I then I felt like the mechanic. So Levy Campaign as a system already existed, right? So I didn't need to like proof mechanics. Like there aren't any mechanics there. What I really needed to proof was ideas around new stuff. So I built a physical prototype because to me that's the quickest way that I can get feedback about like, is something working? Does it feel right at the table that I don't necessarily get in a digital space? So I built a whole physical prototype. And I took it to some friends' houses who I play games with, and I asked them, hey, would you help me play test this? And there was stuff that was like so broken right out of the gate that I was like, okay, that needs to be fixed immediately. But I just did that a lot. I was playing the game probably once a week, maybe several times a month with people who were willing. And like, this was not like people who played Levy and Campaign. This was like, I am going to teach you Levy and Campaign, and then I'm going to have you play my game, and then I want your feedback about what you're seeing, which was also valuable in its own way. And then, so that physical prototype was really the gateway to playing a lot at the table. And then about halfway through the process, the map process started and the final art process started, which is atypical typically of games, but there's an embedded artist on the series now, Robert. And so we were working on that. And then I decided to change the color scheme of a bunch of stuff based on my work with him. So I had to like redo the physical prototype twice. Most of the things, and it's like stuff like, oh, I'm changing this symbol that appears in 8 different places on like 6 different components. I need to make new versions of those, right? Which is not the best way to do it, but it's a lot of man hours. But ultimately, I play tested a lot. I've probably played upwards of like probably approaching 50 games of Seljuk at this point. And I have a pretty good idea of where the balance lies, but I'm also not the best Levy and Campaign player. So like right now, the developers on the Levy and Campaign system who develop all the games, they are taking a very intensive like playtest pass at it to see like, and they're very good. Like they're very good at the system. They crush me every time I play them, to see like where some things might need to be tweaked or worked on, balanced differently, stuff like that. So the answer is a lot.
Okay. And then I guess we have a question about whether you specifically played it at Seattle Metro Gamers. Does wargaming happen there? First of all?
It does, yeah. In fact, mostly wargaming happens there. It's the local gaming club here in Seattle. The president is actually Jeff Phipps, the guy who designed Gallipoli in 1950.
Okay, well that explains why.
Yeah, and actually, he play tested the game with me at Metro Seattle Gamers once, and it was awesome because like he was working on Mons at that point, and so we were talking about game design and all that stuff. I'm actually, fun fact behind the curtain, I'm actually in his hotel room right now at a wargame convention for this interview. And I plan to bring it to Metro Seattle Gamers in the coming months so that people can play it and test it out. I got to do a pass on the prototype from the development testing, and then I'll have a new version.
I guess we'll end with tell us about the wargaming scene up in Seattle, because I know that there is one, right? You've got a nice little convention, which Game On is mostly war games, right?
It is. Yeah, it's happening right now. This is the first year it's been 5 days, which is crazy. Dan, the comment here, Dan, thank you so much. I super appreciate that. I love the Palaiologos Byzantine crest in your username, which is amazing. Late Byzantine Empire fan there, it looks like. I think that's, yeah. And then, so Game On happens in Seattle every February. There's a shorter one in the summer. It's a primarily wargaming convention. It's actually happening like down the hall right now. There's a lot of stuff. It's Friday, so there's a ton of people here. OCS, BCS, there's some like Axis, Empires, Totaler Creep. There's a lot of monster games happening, and then a lot of shorter war games as well. So some folks, there were 2 parallel games of the new Europa Universalis happening yesterday. So yeah, it's a great time. Like if you like that like big multiplayer, like intensive, like let's play a game for multiple days. It's like one of my favorite events for that because it's so chill and they deliver food to you right at your table from the hotel, restaurant, and bar, beer, whatever.
That's handy.
Yeah, it's pretty awesome. They do a great job.
We don't have a hotel restaurant at Winterfest. We're lucky there's a coffee machine. I'm just happy every year there's a coffee. Is there coffee? Yes. I don't have
necessity.
Yeah. I was offended when the first Compass Expo I went to when they're like, we do not have coffee at this hotel. I'm like, what? What?
Sounds like you could have cornered the market and made a killing.
What? Yeah, I thought the next year I said, if there's no coffee again, where was it a different location? That location was condemned after that Compass Expo. And is now a parking lot. I said, we're going to Walmart and buying a Keurig. Because there's no way I'm doing this 15-hour day of wargaming with no coffee. That is not working. No, that is unacceptable. I raged at John Kranz about that. John, what are you doing here? This is not acceptable.
Especially as like dinner time rolls around and like you start to feel the CPU cycles start to slow way down, you know, and you're like, I need a jolt.
Oh yeah, about 9 p.m. we're playing BCS. At about 9 p.m. my mental acuity just goes,
yeah,
just like that. It's like 1 minute I'm into the noodly bits, and the other one I don't even know where I am at. So at that point I'm 15 hours into the day anyway. So, but no, I totally understand. But yeah, you've got the game club up there, and yourself, and Jeff Phipps lives up there, and there's some other folks.
Yeah, Bruce Mansfield, I believe, lives up in Bellingham, which is about an hour and a half from here. And the designer Terry Doherty, the guy who's designing the Lock and Load Napoleonics game, is up here. Okay. It's kind of an interesting little like enclave of like war game designers and players. It's a surprisingly large community for like, the area.
Rain is ideal weather to stay inside and play war games.
Absolutely. So that's all we do all winter.
That makes perfect sense to me. All right. So I think we've got some great questions. I think we've sold a couple copies while we were here. So that's fantastic. The link to the P500 page for Seljuk is in the video description, folks. So go check that out if you're watching this after the fact. And I put it in the chat as well. But check it out. The game looks super neat. There's a lot of cool stuff happening in the Levy and campaign space right now. So thanks, Justin, for coming by.
Thank you.
Really appreciate it. And thanks for your forbearance with my incompetent scheduling.
No worries. Anytime.
So I'm on the edge of the cliff here, man. It's amazing I remember to get up in the morning. So thanks, everybody, and we'll see you all again soon.